Hey YouTube, welcome back to my channel, Taylor Talks Tales. Today I have a video for you. It is a coming-of-age horror novel recommendations video. So, I happen to be a very big fan of coming-of-age stories, whether they're mystery, thriller, sci-fi, horror, contemporary, historical fiction, you name it. I really enjoy them. I think there's just a lot you can really get out of a coming-of-age novel. They bring up a lot of really interesting ideas and thoughts and observations about the world, so I really appreciate them. And I really think with coming of age and horror just work really well together. It's like peanut butter and jelly, macaroni and cheese, they just complement each other beautifully. I think part of it is just when you have to deal with a horrific event or loss of a loved one, or you're battling monsters, or you're just going through trauma, you have to grow up and you have to sort of experience this loss of innocence, or, you know, confront your fears. All elements of a good coming of age story. So, in this video, I'm going to talk about a bunch of different stories. Most of them are horror. There are a couple I might consider to be either dark fiction or maybe like dark fantasy, but regardless, if you're a horror fan, I'm pretty sure you will enjoy it because it has, you know, some element of horror to it. And before we get into this video, I just want to say I am dedicating this video to the class of 2020 because I feel pretty bad that a lot of you will unfortunately not be able to graduate, and that's sort of a rite of passage in at least the United States. Whether it's middle school, high school, getting your undergraduate degree, graduate degree, medical school, you name it, class of 2020, this video is dedicated to you. So, let's dive into the recommendations. I will say these books, they aren't necessarily in specific order except until you get to the last three. The last three, if somebody just came up to me and you're like, hey, name me a really good coming-of-age horror story that I should check out if I haven't really read it before, or, you know, a classic coming-of-age horror story, and I would mention one of those three. But anyway, let's get into the books. So first book I want to talk about is Rotters by Daniel Kraus, which I actually really like this cover. So this story, I wanted to bring this up first because I think this is a very underrated novel. It's a young adult novel, although I feel like it doesn't really read or feel like a YA novel because it's pretty mature and it's very dark and pretty graphic at times because this has to deal with grave robbing, which I think is really interesting for a subject matter. So in this book you follow a 16-year-old boy. His name is Joey Crouch. He lives with his mother. Things are all fine and dandy until she gets run over by a bus and dies. He ends up getting sent to live with his father in rural Iowa, and it's a bit of a culture shock for him, and it's a rough adjustment because he goes to live with his dad. He's never met his father, and his dad is kind of gruff, and you can kind of tell he doesn't really want Joey around. And he notices there's some weird things. His dad keeps weird hours. He tends to disappear for days at a time. The place stinks, and his dad reeks, and he's like, what is up with this smell? And finally, at some point, his dad was gone for quite some time, and then his dad gets in trouble with the school and Child Protective Services and just, you know, all those people, and they're like, okay, you can't leave your son for days at a time. He's 16, but he's still a minor. So the dad ends up bringing Joey along and introduces him to his trade, which is grave robbing. And it goes from there, and I don't want to say too much more about it because I think this book really is a good book to just go into it not knowing too much about it, because there are some really cool things that happen in the story, especially when you get to about 3/4 in and it really ramps up. And this book is all about fathers and sons and, you know, coming of age, and it's just really well done, I think. But disclaimer, this book is gross at times, like very gruesome. Not in terms of violence, there aren't a lot of violent scenes, but if dead bodies and like corpses and rotten stuff really bother you, then you're gonna probably have some issues with this book. This book is where I learned what a rat king was, and I'm pretty sure this is the book where I learned what a coffin birth was as well. So it goes places, and it's pretty icky at times, but it's definitely worth it, so I highly recommend checking this one out. Alright, next one I want to mention is A Foster Homes and Flies by Chad Lutzke. This is the most recent addition to this list, and this is actually the book that inspired me to make this video, because I realized oh, I tend to read a lot of coming-of-age stories. And this is the novella. All these are full-fledged books except for this one. This one is just a novella. This one, you follow a 12-year-old boy. His name is Denny, and he lives with his alcoholic and just very abusive mother. She's end-stage alcoholic, and she's just very neglectful, and is just kind of a very hateful, awful woman. So Denny one day wakes up to find her dead just in front of the TV, and he has to make a choice about what to do. He's been training for the last year to enter this spelling bee, and it's really important for him to do it. So he decides that because he doesn't want to get sent to a foster home or sent away before he has a chance to do the spelling bee, which is only a week away, he decides to just leave his mom where she is. And this takes place in New Orleans, and it's a hot time there. So things get icky pretty quickly and just goes from there. But it's really a strong novella. I would say it's probably more dark fiction as opposed to horror. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. I shaved off a half star just because I think I wanted it to go a little deeper into some of the darker elements. Like, I wanted it to really get into that horror element because, like, you know, interacting with the dead body, I feel like it was glossed over at times. But other than that, I really like this a lot. And there's, you know, you can really tell that Chad Lutzke likes coming-of-age stories. There are multiple Easter eggs throughout this and multiple references to other coming-of-age stuff. So definitely check this one out. Alright, next one. I've already talked about this book on my channel a couple of times actually, and I have a review for it, so I'm going to link the review down below. But that is December Park by Ronald Mulvey. And I'm very happy to have this book because I believe it's out of print now. So this book, I really enjoy it a lot. I would say it's a little more of a thriller and less of a horror, but there are still definitely horror elements to it, and if you're a horror fan, you'll like it. You pretty much follow this group of boys. It's 1993, and the main boy is Angelo. He goes by Angie, and they live in a very small town, and they are experiencing a serial killer about. So there are a bunch of kids that are disappearing, and the serial killer ends up being named the Pied Piper because he whisks the children away. And it's all about them solving the mystery, especially since the main character, Angelo, his father is a police officer, so he kind of has a little bit of an inside view of the case. And it's a solid book. I really enjoy it. It's pretty long, and it may be slow for some people at times, but I really liked the coming of age element to it, and the friendships. I feel like this is a very solid friend group. I really like Angie as a character. I feel like we would have been friends when I was 15 because he was super into horror stuff, and like his bedroom is like covered in horror things, and he likes to read and all that. So I'm like, oh, we would have been buddies. And I just think it's very underrated, so I hope that you guys check it out and check out my full review down below. Alright, next one. This book, a lot of people don't think of it as a coming-of-age story, but I personally do, and that is The Troop by Nick Cutter. So, I feel like with The Troop, what makes it a coming-of-age story is there really is a lot of like loss of innocence and these boys having to fight against, this monstrous thing by themselves. So, in this story, you pretty much follow, there's a, scout troop. They are on a uninhabited island with their scoutmaster, and there's this gentleman who washes ashore in a boat who's infected with these horrific internal worm parasites, which infect the scoutmaster, and then things just explode from there. And I really do think that this is, at least, I don't know if I would say it's a purely coming-of-age story, but I feel like it deserves to be on the list because it does have those, there are just some scenes when you're reading it where you're like, oh, you can really feel these boys growing up and experiencing a loss of innocence and dealing with trauma and realizing we're going to have to save ourselves, and that is a very big adult thing to think about. So I definitely recommend The Troop. I also have a full-fledged review of this on my channel, which I will also link below. Alright, next one is Mystery Walk by Robert McCammon, who's one of my favorite authors. I love McCammon's work. and this one is no exception. I like this one a lot, and I feel like not a lot of people bring this one up as much as some of his other stories. So, Mystery Walk follows a boy. His name is Billy Creekmore. He is part Native American. His mother was part Choctaw, and his father is white, and his father is very fundamentalist Christian, and both Billy and his mother can see and talk to the dead. They can commune with spirits, and they can help spirits out, and they have these sort of mystical powers, which Billy's father doesn't necessarily always approve of. And then you have another boy on the almost opposite side of the spectrum. His name is Wayne, and he is the son of a evangelical fundamentalist preacher dude. So Wayne and his dad are involved in sort of like the revival movement, and like he heals people by putting his hands on them, all of that. And it really is a story following the two boys, and it ends up being sort of a story of good versus evil. And there's also some Native American mythology in this, not like tons and tons, but it does play a role, and it's just a really solid story. And I really think that Robert McCammon was trying to point out some hypocritical stuff of the 80s, especially there are a lot of televangelists and revivalist preachers in the 80s when this was written, so that definitely plays a role in this. There's also some stuff that happens at a carnival, and I love stuff that take place at like carnivals and festivals, amusement parks, you name it. So there's a lot to this story, and it really does follow Billy from when his mother is pregnant with him all the way up to I think he's 21, like early 20s, so it really does follow, you know, his progression of, you know, from being a very small child and then coming into his own and his powers, and yeah, there's a lot of good versus evil going on, but this is very enjoyable, and I do want to do a full-fledged review on this at some point. Alright, next one, I'm actually going to do two books at once. These are two stories by Ray Bradbury. So we have Something Wicked This Way Comes, which I've got like the old vintage cover, and then we have The Halloween Tree. So Ray Bradbury is very good at capturing childhood nostalgia. I think he was really into boyhood and childhood, and a lot of his stories do incorporate that. I debated about putting Dandelion Wine on here, but I skipped it in favor of these two. So Halloween Tree, you are following a group of friends. One of their friends disappears, and they end up having to save their friend by sort of exploring and learning about the history of Halloween. And it's a very short book. It's a really good book for you to read around Halloween time or even on Halloween. You can really read this in one sitting, no problem. And then the other one that I'm probably going to talk a little bit more about because I feel like the coming of age element is stronger in this one, Something Wicked This Way Comes, which this one follows two boys, they're best friends. It's Will and Jim, and Will was born on October 30th, 1 minute before midnight, and Jim was born on October 31st, 1 minute after midnight, and they've grown up together, they're neighbors, and they're best buddies, and they end up, there's this sort of like a traveling carnival circus type thing that shows up on a train, and they are very excited, but it's pretty evident pretty early on that there's something up with this carnival, and they have to investigate what it is. It almost seems like it's too good to be true, and then soon it becomes a battle for basically their very souls, as this guy right here, who's the head of the carnival, has some pretty vile plans for them, and it's just a very classic story. It's a really good book to read during the fall because this takes place in October, and Ray Bradbury loved October very much, and there's a lot of quotable passages in this, so there's definitely very much a coming of age story, and also a little bit of relationship between fathers and sons too, and relationship between friends. So these are both good, but I would say the coming of age element is a little bit stronger in this one. Alright, next one is the first book of this author I'm going to have on this list. There are two more by this author, so hang tight, you'll probably figure out what the other two are. But the first one I want to mention is The Talisman by Stephen King, and of course Peter Straub. They collaborated on this story together. I have not read the sequel to this yet, but I read this one last year. It's one of the few Stephen King books in my collection that I've only read once, just because I'd put it off for whatever reason for a while, and I really enjoyed this quite a bit. You're pretty much following a 12-year-old boy. In fact, there are quite a few 12-year-old boys who are in books on this list. His name's Jack, and his mother is dying of some unknown disease or some sort of cancer, and he is pretty devastated by it. And he ends up meeting somebody, this older gentleman, who helps him realize that there is a parallel world. And getting into that parallel world, which Jack can do, he can find this thing called the talisman, and if he gets that, he can save his mother. But that's going to entail him going on a very big journey, and there are a lot of people after him because he has this talent which he inherited from his father. And his father died, his father was murdered, and it just goes from there. It's just this like big epic story, you know, traveling across America while also going to this parallel world, and there are definitely elements of the Dark Tower into this story. But I do think at its heart it really is a coming-of-age story, and I also think it's really you know, strong story of a son doing anything to save his mother, so that aspect's very sweet. So definitely would mention this one, and of course Stephen King I think writes kids very well. Alright, next one I'm going to talk briefly. There are 3 books by the same author, and I really enjoy this author. So we have Coraline by Neil Gaiman. We have The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. And we have The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. So we've got his 3 works here. And the reason why I'm bringing these up, even if technically these may fall under dark fantasy, magical realism, etc., etc., I will say I personally think that Coraline is a horror novel. If you are a kid and you read this book, it's very creepy. I read this as a child and definitely creeped me out in a very good way. I loved this book. I love the movie, and this sweater I'm wearing is actually a replica of Coraline's sweater that she wears from the movie, so I wanted to wear it for this video. And I really think that there are coming-of-age elements in all 3 of these books, because in this one, you have Coraline, and she and her parents move into a new place, and she's bored, she's lonely, she doesn't feel like her parents give her enough attention, and she decides to explore the place, and she discovers this other place through this door, and she has her other mother and her other father, and everything seems really neat there, and magical, and perfect in what she wants. But very quickly, she realizes there's something very wrong with this place, and nothing is as it seems. And I do think that Coraline really grows as a character throughout the story, and at the end she's a lot different than she is at the beginning, so I do think that there is a coming-of-age element to this, and it's definitely, you know, creepy story. And of course the Graveyard Book is also, Neil Gaiman had said that he was inspired by the Jungle Book when he wrote this, and you essentially follow this little toddler who escapes a family slaughter by this man, like serial killer kind of dude, and he ends up getting into this graveyard, and he's raised by the ghosts and spooks and vampire and all that live there. And each chapter is kind of its own little story that kind of progresses the boy as he grows up. He ends up being called Bod, which is short for nobody, or nobody. And there's definitely very much a coming-of-age element to this too, because he starts as a toddler, and then it ends when he's, I think, 15 or 16, and is kind of off on his, you know, he goes and is a teenager. And I didn't want to spoil anything more, but, you know, essentially he does grow up, and each story kind of pushes things along, and he learns stuff about the world and about himself, so we've got that. And then, of course, Ocean at the End of the Lane has that sort of traditional coming-of-age aspect where you have an adult narrator reflecting back on his childhood. The narrator in this is never named, and he ends up going back home to attend a funeral, and while there he ends up going to this farm at the end of the lane, and all of a sudden has this resurgence of all of these childhood memories, and he's trying to figure out, was this real, was this not? And it's just really well done and imaginative, and there are a few creepy scenes for sure. This one probably is the least horror of these three, but at the same time it's very strong on the coming of age aspect, you know, dealing with childhood nostalgia and even forgetting aspects of your childhood, just everything like that. So, and one last thing I want to mention with all three of these books is I read this one as a child when I was 10, right around Coraline's age. I read this one as a teenager when it came out, when I was like either 15 or 16, which is at the end, age spot is at the end of the book. And then this one I read when it came out as a very young adult. So I think I was 21 or 22 when it came out, so not the age of the character in this, but still I just think it was kind of cool to read all of these at different points of my life when they all have to deal with some sort of aspect of coming of age. Next one is The Thief of Always by Clive Barker. Whenever anybody asks me if they're, you know, if somebody really likes Coraline, what's the next best thing to Coraline, I'll definitely say The Thief of Always. This has elements similar to Coraline, but it's different enough that you can still enjoy both, and I like both a lot. This one follows this little boy named Harvey. I forgot exactly how old he is. I think he's like 11 or 12, and he lives with his parents, and it's just the middle of February, and he's just super bored. Like, he's just in this very blah state of mind, and every day seems to run in together, and he's very unhappy, and he just, you know, can't wait for summer, and he's just really, really bored. One day, this kind of monstrous humanoid dude flies in through his window and introduces himself, and he's like, hey, you know what? There's this really awesome place that you can go to take a break. It's a, you know, holiday house, essentially, so you can go here and live for a few days, having a lot of fun and taking a break from school and the monotony of life and all that. So he decides to go with this creature, and he goes to Mr. Hood's holiday house, and he ends up falling in love with it for a little bit because it's really fantastical. Each day has all 4 seasons, so it starts off as spring in the morning, and then summer in the afternoon, then fall in the kind of evening, and then in the like nighttime it is winter, which means that Halloween is every evening, Christmas is every night, and you have all your heart's desires answered. You have the best food, and you get a toy every Christmas that's whatever you want. Even if it's something from your childhood that your dad made that you lost, it will be replicated. And there are other kids there to play. And it sounds awesome, but pretty quickly Harvey realizes that there's something off about this place, and so he decides to start investigating, and then decides that he's like, I need to escape, and then the story goes from there. And it's definitely creepy. There's definitely a coming of age aspect because Harvey goes through a lot of transformations as he starts from the beginning into the very end, where he really, you know, I feel like grows as a character and matures. So all that good stuff of a coming of age story. So definitely check this one out. I think it's pretty underrated and a very enjoyable story. And if the people who did Coraline ever made an adaptation of this story, I would be so thrilled. Alright, next one is Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones. So this is a werewolf story. It's the most unique werewolf story I think I've read because it's very different. This book follows a boy. He's just kind of like with Ocean at the End of the Lane. He is never given a name. Technically there is a name he went by at one point, but it's shown in the novel that, you know, his family moves around a lot and they're constantly changing names, so you don't actually know what his name is. But this book follows a boy who lives in a family of werewolves, and they are very poor, they're constantly moving, and they've done some crimes in the past, you name it. Working class werewolves, kind of living paycheck to paycheck, day by day, very authentic and gritty feeling, I would say. And it really is a coming-of-age story, like very much a coming-of-age story, and it really focuses more on character development as opposed to plot. So if you are somebody who really wants a plot-heavy book, this is not going to be the book for you, because it's, I mean, there is a plot, but it's sort of meandering, and it really just is an exploration of the main character and his family, because there's some pretty strong family ties in this, and it's a very unique story. It really takes the werewolf mythology and kind of twists it on its head at times, or just kind of tries to find scientific explanations for stuff. So I definitely recommend giving it a shot. It's very enjoyable and unique, so if you're kind of burnt out of werewolf stories, you know, I still suggest giving this one a shot because I think you'll probably like it. Alright, next up is Children of the Dark by Jonathan Janz, which I enjoy this cover quite a bit. I think it just looks very aesthetically pleasing. So this book follows the main character. His name is Will. He is 15 years old, and he lives in a small town, and he has his friends. He's not super popular, but he's got some friends. He's on the baseball team, and he has to deal with some bullies and some sometimes crappy situations, but he's a good kid. He is pretty much in charge of taking care of his his younger sister, Peach, who's 6 years old, because his mother is an opioid addict, so she's pretty much out of the picture. She's kind of out of it a good chunk of the time, but she's trying. She's a better mother than a Foster Homes and Flies. Like, that mother was awful. This one, she is a sympathetic character at times. It's just she's also a bit neglectful. And this story pretty much follows Will and his buddies. And there's a serial killer that ends up escaping prison and comes to their town. While that's happening, there's something going on in the woods where they live right by that all of a sudden is killing people, and they have to find out what the situation is while also fighting to survive, because this book actually has a pretty high body count and it's pretty gory, and once it takes off, it really takes off. So I definitely recommend this book. It's pretty enjoyable. It has some interesting mythology to it. I do wish that the mythology was explored a little bit more, but other than that, I liked it quite a bit and highly recommend this story, especially because, you know, Will's a pretty solid character, and he definitely shows a lot of growth and maturity throughout the story. Alright, next one. I almost didn't put this on this list, but I put it on because I wanted to have a few more female coming-of-age stories on here, because unfortunately the vast majority of my favorites are centered around boys in particular. Not sure why. I think it's just because there aren't as many girl coming-of-age horror stories out there. So I put this one on this list. My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. And I do like this book, but it's probably one of the weaker books on this list, just because I feel like the horror elements in this are kind of horror light. Like, it didn't go into horror as much as I wanted to. There are some parts that are pretty funny, and, you know, it's enjoyable, but it's not without its flaws. But I still put it on here because there is a pretty strong coming-of-age element to this. I really like how there's a female friendship at the focus of the story. So pretty much the story follows Abby and Gretchen. They are best buddies going back to, I think, 4th grade. And they're, like, really into E.T. and roller skating and all these, like, very fun 80s things. When they get to high school, they're still good friends. But at some point, Gretchen, after doing something, some drugs, or, you know, they basically are at a party, and all of a sudden she just becomes like a totally different person. And Abby is really freaked out. She's like, this is my best friend. She's acting, you know, not herself. What is up with this? So she ends up trying to figure out and help out Gretchen. And part of this book is sort of like is she possessed? Is she not? And then at some point it does take, you know, a path and goes down it. And I do enjoy this, you know, I think it's a really fun read. I also adore this cover. I love this cover so much, and it's a fun read. It just, I would recommend it for people who maybe are just now getting into horror, because it is, you know, I feel like for the most part it doesn't have a lot of horror elements to it that are super strong, in my opinion. I would have liked it to be a little bit darker and a little bit more intense, but I still think it's fun. So My Best Friend's Exorcism is a good choice. Next one is the graphic novel on my list, and I adore this story. So this is, my favorite thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris, and let me just say, the artwork in this is spectacular. It's so unique, and I mean, it's so cool. You just flip to any page at all, and it's just neat. I mean, there you go. So, I like this book. This is a female coming-of-age horror story, except for the fact that it's so much more than a horror story. It is very much a cross-genre story. There's mystery, there's historical fiction, there's almost a feeling of a little bit of a contemporary feel to it, and of course horror and maybe even a little bit of magical realism. I don't know, there's just so much going on with this story, but pretty much in this book you follow a girl named Karen, and this story takes place in the 1960s, and Karen lives with her family, and she has an older brother who's like significantly older than her. He's a little bit of a sleazy man-ho, but he also introduces her to some really cool like horror comics and stories and all of that, and he's just a complicated character. And she lives in an apartment below a Holocaust survivor she's really interested in, and the Holocaust survivor is a woman who is actually the woman on the cover, and she ends up dying, and Karen decides, I want to figure out who it is who murdered her, and in order to do that she has to explore her backstory, the woman's backstory involving the Holocaust and so much more. And it's just a great treat of a book. There's so much to it. It's very enjoyable. I've reread it multiple times now, and there's going to be a second book coming out. Volume 2 should be coming out sometime this year, and I'm very excited for it. I just think this is a wonderful, wonderful story, and it's very, I don't think there's really much like it out there, and everything from the art to the story itself. And I like Karen a lot. She's draws herself as a little werewolf girl, and I like her spunk to her and just everything. She's a cool character. It's a cool story. Definitely check it out. Alright, we're getting to the last 4. So, next one is also a female coming-of-age horror story, which may seem a little weird that I'm putting it as a coming-of-age, but when you read it, trust me, there are very strong elements of coming-of-age to this book. And that is The Rust Maidens by Gwendolyn, I think it's Keist. Either Keist or Keist. I apologize for pronouncing the last name right. I think it's Keist, actually. So, this book is really good, very underrated. I think more people should check it out. So it takes place, it's a dual timeline story. You have main character, her name's Phoebe. In present day, she is going back home to help her mom pack up their house. She hasn't been back in like 20 years. And she has kind of had a bit of a rough life. And part of it has to do with what happened in 1980. So in 1980, she was 18 years old, just about to graduate from high school, when one of her best friends and her cousin and a few other girls in the area of Cleveland, sort of like a small little chunk of Cleveland that's right by a steel mill, they end up all of a sudden transforming. Slowly but surely, they almost get infected with something where they start like leaking like mercury and metal. They like are turning into like these rusty metal women where like there's metal coming out of them and their blood changes, and it's just really interesting how they transform, and nobody can explain why, and it just changes their neighborhood up, and it brings up a lot of issues, and Phoebe's sort of at the heart of this, and especially she's impacted because it's both, her cousin and friend and other people that she knows, and it's kind of traumatizing for her. So it goes back and forth between present day and 1980 while you figure out what happened, and then in present day it looks like there may be somebody who's going through that again. So this book is really good. There's almost like a sense of melancholy to it, and it's almost a little depressing at times, where I'm like, I don't know if I want to go visit Cleveland because it sounds so sad. It's just like, everything's falling apart, and it's Rust Belt depression and stuff, but very good. I also like that the main character was, when she was younger, was interested in bugs and insects and wanted to major in entomology, because, fun fact, I almost minored in entomology in college, but I wasn't allowed to because I wasn't a biology major, but I just thought that I haven't met a girl character who liked bugs, so I thought that was fun. So definitely check this out, especially for a good female coming-of-age horror story. Alright, last 3. And you'll see why these are the last three and why these are the kind of the three I would just off the top of my head mention. First one is, of course, Stephen King's The Body. I feel bad. I actually should have put this on my top Stephen King list, but I neglected to. This is a very strong story, and it's very short. It's pretty much a novella, and I read this multiple times. It is the story that inspired Stand By Me. Essentially, you're following several boys who are 12 years old, and they want to go discover the body of a boy from another town who died by getting run over by a train track. And, well, they go exploring, they're on a little bit of a journey, and it's all about their relationship with each other and their relationship with their dads, and a lot of complicated factors like that. Bullies, you name it. It's just so well written, too. There's a lot of quotes that are just amazing from this story, so this is definitely a wonderful, wonderful coming-of-age story. Highly recommend it. It's a classic. Next one is Boy's Life by Robert McCammon. I did a book review of this that I will also link down below. This is also a wonderful coming-of-age story. It's a very big book. I highly recommend it. It's cross-genre, so there are definitely horror elements to it, but it's more than that. There's crime, there's mystery, there's historical fiction, there's a lot of tender moments. There's so much to it, but essentially you follow a main character. His name's Corey, and when he was a boy, because it's told pretty much, at the very beginning, he's an older man, and then he's reflecting back on his childhood of this one incident that happened, where essentially he and his father, they lived in the small town of Zephyr, Alabama during the 60s, and they end up discovering a dead body in a car that had been murdered. And it shows how the dad was impacted, how Corey's impacted, and how this just event ripples through the town and their lives, and it just has so much, racial tensions, and it has a little bit of magic and magical realism to it, and just so much, even a little bit of folklore, and just the characters are really memorable. It's a wonderful story. I highly recommend it to anybody who wants to check it out, and at the very end of it, you just are going to sit there in awe, and it's like, oh wow, this was just a wonderful read, and it's totally worth, plowing through a very large book. So definitely recommend Boy's Life. This and Swan Song are Robert McCammon's two best works, in my opinion. Last but not least, I'm pretty sure you guys are going to know what this one is, and that is It by Stephen King. This is such a classic, and I think when I think of coming-of-age horror novels, my brain automatically goes to this one. It's just very impactful and memorable, and I think it really left a mark on the horror genre and horror community when it came out, and I reread this quite often. Even though it's a very large book, I just love it so much. It has to do with, loss of innocence and overcoming your childhood fears, and, almost like, there are elements of, like, what you remember from your childhood and what you don't and what you forget. And, of course, there's an excellent friendship group at the heart of this, Losers Club, and it ripples out. There's just so much to this book that I really would have to do a full-fledged book review on this to really talk about how awesome it is. But it really is good. And even if you've seen the movies, you should still check out the book, because there's just such a big depth to this story. It's, I think, really timeless. Like, I think it's really going to be a classic, not just in horror, but just in, the world of fiction, because I do know quite a few people who don't even necessarily like horror a whole lot who still will pick up this book and say it's still a solid story. And it really is, because it just touches on a lot of stuff, and it's big, but it's worth it, and when you're done with it, you're gonna just, really have enjoyed the journey that you go on with the rest of the kids. So, yeah. This is where you get the town of Derry, Maine, and of course our wonderful 12-year-old and 13-year-old kids. So, anyway, the classic number 1, Stephen King's It. So, those are my coming-of-age horror stories that I recommend. And there are other ones out there. These are just my favorites. And I will say one quick thing. I haven't finished Summer of Night by Dan Simmons. I know there are going to be some people who are wondering where the heck it is on this list, and that's because I haven't finished it. And it's really weird why I haven't, and part of it has to do with the fact that every time I reread it, I all of a sudden am like inspired to read Summer of Night. But then when I start reading Summer of Night, I all of a sudden am like, wait, but I keep wanting this to be it in a way, which is not fair to Summer of Night. So what I just need to do at some point is just in like a few months or something, just sit down and read it after it's been a while since I've read it or seen the movie It or anything like that. So that's why it's not on this list. But anyway, let me know if you've read any of these books, and or if you plan on reading any of these books, and you know what you thought of them. And I hope you guys have an awesome day, and I will talk to you guys later. Happy reading.